time. You're like, I got a day off. This looks like a good talk. So,
Glad you could.
what do you do for Galois?
Marketing and communications.
Okay.
And
Fine.
a little bit of some other stuff.
All right.
So,
Nice.
what do you do for Itron?
Security architecture.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So there should be some people remote. There should be some
Okay.
I'm gonna like visiting.
Whenever you want me to
Yeah.
start. that's fine.
Good. Maybe you're making a regular thing.
Yeah.
So that's actually my first time hearing about Galois. So I think something security related, I guess.
Yeah. Just computer science research
Yeah.
in general field of security, reliability,
Oh, cool. There's a lot of progress.
software correctness kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, that's a field that desperately needs more work.
All right. Yeah. Well,
How profitable is it? I don't know. That's for you guys to figure out.
sorry.
The profitability on the other hand is for you guys to figure out.
Yeah. Therein lies the problem sometimes.
All right. It's so difficult.
It does look like the various branches are linked, so you should be good on Dayton and Arlington.
Okay.
Maybe 1 minute.
Yeah. Take it.
That's a very good point. Is it far enough away? Probably is. Oh, that's where it is. There's a lot. Most of our tech talks are public, so we advertise them, so they're open for anybody in town. We used to get a lot of people from, but there's very few that show up these days. Not all of them are, so some of them are private. We don't share them.
Yeah, we're getting.
We used to get more people coming to these from
Would you like
somewhere.
me to introduce you, or would you?
Whichever. Whatever.
Depends on how much you want to.
Things to do.
But,
So I guess not a lot.
We can
I
get
can
started,
start.
or I can introduce
We can,
You were just not doing enough.
if you want to,
Oh, you never know. It's on the other side.
I'm okay with either.
Fair.
Okay.
All right.
Topic, I guess, matters. Yeah.
So you want to introduce them? Go ahead. Yep, yep.
All right. Can everybody hear me online, Arlington, Dayton? Can you guys hear me?
Maybe we can't hear them.
Maybe not. Can someone in Arlington or Dayton say something?
I think the computer is muted at the moment because it's
They're
a public
muted.
stream. So
Oh, it's
Okay.
public.
It's okay.
So they won't be able to hear me?
yeah,
Am I-
we tested already.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, well, we're going to go get started. For those of you who don't know why we're here, this is a Bud Mishra person I've known for the last year. So he had a student named William Casey, who I knew very well from my work at CMU. And Bud has done some foundational work in software model checking. He wrote the first paper really on software model checking under Ed Clark at CMU. And we won't go into the details of what happened with all that. But he's done some foundational work in bio-inspired systems, in cancer, essentially in how to apply formal methods in computational systems and mathematics to the diagnosis and treatment of cancer. And he is currently at New York University in Courant and is a professor there at NYU. And today he's going to be talking about cellularization, a game theoretic perspective, which has a lot of applications between blockchain and mathematical frameworks and formal methods. And I think you guys are going to find it very interesting. So, Bud, thanks for coming.
Thank you, James. I'm essentially going to tell stories, hopefully interesting stories. But if they get dull or meandering, just stop me and ask questions, interrupt me. I know that I'm giving a talk at a formal methods place, but there's really no reason to be formal or methodological. So we'll break lots of rules. So I just turned 60, and there were lots of parties and 60 Budfest and things like that. And one thing I told my wife that this is a good sign that there will be no more job offers. And the next day, somebody calls me from Imperial College, and the guy asks, what would make it possible for you to come to London? I said, Trump, if he tweets more, and someday I'll just walk away. And he says, no, we have Boris Johnson, and you can't go to Italy because there's Matteo Salvini. You can't go to India because there's Modi. There's Hungary has dictator Orban. So I'm like lost. Where would I go? Okay, so I found there is a new planet, Earth-like planet, Kepler 22b, B22, and it's Earth-like. I can breathe oxygen and do things, and so I got thinking, really seriously. So what is going to be in this new planet that I could move to and avoid all these political turmoils? So can we find multicellular alien life forms somewhere else? Will there be like organisms, not just single cells, but more complex than that? Will they look anything like us in the body plan? Will they have a mouth in the front? That's ventral, and anus in the back. I don't know why that's important. But our first origin of orifice is actually anus. But in other organisms, it could be mouth, especially in lobsters. And it has a lot of connections to the asymmetry, where our heart is, how we use ambidexterity, etc. So I don't know why, but that's important to me if I move to a planet. Will they have feelings? Will they have a central nervous system? Will they have neurons connected in a multi-layer network? That's now going from dorsal ventral structure. We're talking about anterior posterior structure. And that is totally governed by Hoxbox genes and the way positional information works. And in many organisms, they are actually completely preserved. So the central nervous system is very closely related to the anterior-posterior positional system, right? In the morphogenesis. Will they have limbs? I think that's important. Limbs are important. Will they have fingers? How many fingers? 5 fingers? 6 fingers? Is there an archetypical structure to our body plans? Turns out it's not. 5 fingers, pentadactylity is not the most common thing. There were ichthyostega and acanthostega with 6 and 7 fingers. So there's nothing magical about 5 fingers. Or 4 limbs. And there were big debates between Robert Owen and other physiologists about an archetypical structure to body plans. Will they say Klaatu, Barada, Nikto? Will they have languages? And will they say sentences like that? Will they trade in gold kryptonites? Will they have AI? And will the AI be deep? I don't know, it's important. How deep? 137 layers? Will they have a theory that multicellular life could have evolved on Earth about 1 billion years ago? Actually, multicellular life is very uncommon. Life is very uncommon. Only one planet that we know of. And multicellular life is even presumed to be more uncommon. It appeared about 1 billion years ago out of nowhere, Cambrian explosion, and there were 5 different life forms. Metazoans, people, animals like us, plants, blue algae, green algae, and fungus. It's unheard of because we assume evolution to be divergent. There's no teleological purpose for multicellularity. Why did that happen? Okay. So these are the kinds of questions I ask myself.
The easy ones.
Right. So what is common to these questions? Are these just conventional? Maybe something else could have happened. Maybe 8 limbs would have been okay. Maybe a different language would have been okay. They have something in common. One is there's something like a emergence out of nothing, pop hypothesis, Big Bang of evolution, or frozen accident. That's how we describe these phenomena. This is evolution by jerks, not evolution by creeps. There's this jerky movement to the evolution. And there are some explanation. The one explanation for multicellularity is that there was a snowball Earth 650 million years ago. There were volcanic reactions, and that melted things and spewed out a lot of calcium and phosphate, and that led to Cambrian explosion and multicellularity. As if that event was absolutely important for the evolution. There was a KPG extinction event, and that wiped out dinosaurs and gave mammalians a room to grow. A Great American Exchange, where the 2 North and South America got connected, and that created severe climate changes in El Nino and things like that. There was a wet Sahara. There was a 10 years period where Sahara became wet, and humans moved out of Africa into the Shul Valley. That population died, and there was another population that moved through Bab el-Mandeb to India and Sunda and Sahul and Australia, Mongol population, and there are other waves. So what we see of humans now could have been wiped out in Rift Valley. It just so happened that 120 people crossed, and there are all of us running around, running the planet, building internets, right? There was something called Younger Dryas, the big freeze where the glaciers moved out and pushed back. That created the Indo-European zone. So humans moved sideways and south, and they spoke the same language, had some culturally similar activities, they had similar gods, they had shining gods and dark gods, etc. So how much of it is conventional? And why should we ask these questions? Right? The reason is that a lot of things we are doing right now are like Cambrian explosion. We are creating technologies and architectures and structures. How much of it is logical? How much of it should be engineered and formally verified? And how much of it is simply conventions? Conventions built on top of conventions, right? So we are not allowed to do double spending because there is a convention that we can't keep track of or audit expenses if they don't add up in some way. And so we build technologies on top of conventions, and we also create conventions as we do things. And what should they look like? So let me start with a story on evolution. It's a very old story and goes back to Francis Crick and related to Crick's frozen accident. So it's about origin of life. And the argument was that there were 4 stages to the origin of life. There were ATPs, adenosine triphosphates. Those are monomers. Those monomers combine to make polymers RNA. So there's ATP, CTP, GTP, and TTP, right? ATCGs. And they create our uracil in case of RNA. And they created long strings of polymers, and that was the RNA world. They could duplicate themselves, they could interact with themselves. And 2 of the RNA that are important are mRNA and tRNA, messenger RNA and tRNA. They talk to each other to send messages or string triphosphates together. And into this world, there was an accident. Amino acids arrived, some kind of 7 different amino acids. Those are abiotic. They had no biological origin. And the trouble with amino acid is that they can string together, and they may not be soluble, and they can interact with water to make hydrogen peroxide. They're highly toxic. They could destroy the RNA. So the RNA's job was to string these amino acids together into nice strings so that they are not monomers, monopolymers, not the same amino acids strung together over and over, nor are they random, because they would be highly toxic, right? So they need to create something that is both hydrophobic and hydrophilic and has structures and dissolves in water, etc. And they needed a code to talk to each other to do that. Right? That's the Codons, an anti-codon system, and that evolved 3.5 billion years ago. And people tried to recreate the theory by doing experiments, and Miller and Urey did an experiment in 1952, was supposed to be the most important paper appearing in Science or Nature in 1952, but it turned out not to be. The most important paper became Watson and Crick's paper on DNA structure, which was thought to be a sideshow, an unimportant little result. But one interesting thing about this experiment, which was not published, was that Miller and Urey actually created something like 85 different amino acids. But they were worried that if they report that result, the paper wouldn't get published because there are only 21 amino acids. So how do you explain that? And one idea is to using what Crick called frozen accident. Somehow the Codon Anti-Codon mapping came by accident, and that froze, and then that became the system, and that created proteins. And the good sequences that organized these proteins became remembered, became encoded in an immutable system called DNA. So think of DNA as the first blockchain that remembers in a distributed way what worked and what didn't work, right? But the idea that it just was an accident and froze is somewhat not helpful, right? Because the probability of something like that happening is very low. The better explanation was through a signaling game where mRNA and tRNA tried different signaling schemes, and what worked would get remembered in a stable Nash equilibrium. And the question would, how complex that stable Nash equilibrium would be, and how stable it would be, how optimal it would be the questions. And we created a model with the birth-death processes, and that came up with schemes that are similar to what we see in life. Right? So there's not 85 different amino acids, it's 20, 21, and you can also imagine mitochondria to be using fewer numbers, and there are certain candidas albicans, some fungus that has more, but more or less that's the boundary. Okay. So it's not optimal in many ways, but it is very close to optimal. And it is also conventional in the sense that the Codon Anti-Codon mapping is one we use, and it has become stable, but there are other possibilities that could have been stable. And in fact, that's being used in synthetic biology to create new proteins, new amino acids that do not follow the Codon anti-codon conventions that we have, the reason is that we can shut down those systems very easily if we introduce it into live systems, right? So think of it like conventions like whether the sugar is right-handed or left-handed. Chirality is just a convention. Once it's there, it builds on top of it. Okay? So what I'm arguing is that all the things that we listed about the planet are probably conventional. It has nothing optimal or guaranteed through some unified theory of science. It's not like quantum mechanics to physics to chemistry, and we would get the life that we see. Okay. Here is one of the problems with this kind of signaling game model. It could be myopic. It could be like frozen accident. It gets to an equilibrium. If it is stable, it stays. The probability of creating anything interesting is low. You can do clairvoyant model where one could see the future, optimize it properly. Like there's an intelligent designer who knows the purpose and designs this, and that would look like the thing in the bottom. And there is a game theoretic model, which is not as optimal as the clairvoyant model, but is significantly better and stable than the myopic model. But there is one problem, is that if mRNA and tRNA are allowed to be game theoretically independent agents, they could actually deceive each other because mRNA has certain information that it doesn't share with tRNA. And that actually happens. And it happens in the context of evolution by duplication. mRNA can create duplicate copies and take advantage of it, and tRNA cannot. Right? So so this is a two-person game who are trying to get a Nash equilibrium, but one can be deceptive and can improve its utility beyond bound. How would you stop them? How would you get the utilities to be aligned? So one idea is cellularization. So you put mRNA and tRNA in the same cell. If they deceive each other, they both die. So the utilities are aligned by fiat, by a structure, by a convention itself. Right? But that doesn't allow some other agents to infiltrate, like a virus, and take care of and use the same codon anti-codons structure convention to fool them. In fact, a retrovirus can write itself into the blockchain, into the DNA, and create the structure where it can misalign the utilities over and over. Right? Is this clear or no? So we're going to use some of these ideas to think about how to build better and more interesting distributed computational system architecture, where there'll be agents, they'll be playing signaling games, there'll be privacy, there'll be correlation of encounter, they could verify certain things, they could use formal methods, they could use cryptography. What would the system look like? What would be a better, stable system that we can design and work with, and take a lot of ideas from biology. And one of the big ideas that I would like to explore is the ability to not only make things distributed, fully distributed, permissionless, peer-to-peer, but at will to create cells and cellularizations that have conventions and norms, and those norms can be formally verified and checked and argued about. This is a 3.5 billion year-old system. It's not doing badly. It has been stable. So that's one way to achieve engineering stability in the systems we want to build. Okay? Okay. So just don't worry about this. This is a question that's more for biologists. Suppose I can rerun the evolution. How close will it be to produce the kind of things we have, given that almost everything we have are conventions? That was the list of questions about the planet we started with. So the story starts with this thing called signaling games. How many of you know what a signaling game is? Okay. So signaling game is like any other classical von Neumann Morgenstern Nash non-cooperative game, but there is information incompleteness. So not all the information is visible to all parties. In particular, there is one party which is informed, called a sender, and it communicates the other player is uninformed, but a receiver. So sender has information, receiver has no information. So in our case, mRNA had information about what the gene should look like. tRNA does not have the information, right? So there are some biological examples. Don't worry too much about it. Just think of sender and receiver games where sender has information and receiver has no information. And these theories were explored by Spence in the context of conventions, but there has been a lot of work in biology. And Axelrod got a Nobel Prize. Axelrod got a Nobel Prize for some of these works. And classical example of signaling game is a lemon market game. So there is somebody selling used cars, and the buyer does not know which one is good quality used car and which one is not. Right? There are many more examples in biology, in med selection, in molecular biology, in biomimicry, but in computer science, from phishing to Sybil attacks, all of this can be thought through in terms of signaling games. Right? So you have sender and receiver, and these roles can be shared. Then the information could be partial, or actions could be distributed. There is a random variable, little t, whose support is given by capital T, also known to senders. So sender actually knows what type he is. Like, I know my type. I know my identity. I know my IP addresses. I know everything about myself. But they can be private to me. And I also may know the correct distribution of these types. Okay? So there is a ground truth that says there are two types of people. One are deceivers, one are honest, and this is the distribution. So the player knows his own type. Think of type as private information. He knows what he is. He has a set of signals to choose from, and he sends a signal to the receiver. Receiver has a set of actions to take, and takes the action. Receiver does not know your type, but takes the action. But there is a utility that depends on the sender or receiver that depends on the type and the message and the action. Does that make sense? So think of you taking an Uber. Your Uber driver does not know where you are going. You know where you are going. You may or may not know the surge pricing, right? And you are going to, Uber may select a driver for you, and you may accept it, but once you are in the Uber, it will know the destination, etc., and your utilities will depend on something else. Your utility may depend on how fast you can get to your location, how little money you pay. Uber drivers' utility may depend on how many stars he gets, what reputation he gets, how much money he gets, how much tips he gets, and where he is to take the next round. Is this clear or no? Okay. So the utilities may or may not be aligned. So if you're aligned utility, these games are very simple and interesting. But it's actually even more interesting if, in the absence of the information, you don't know the utilities and how aligned they are. But there is strategy spaces or strategies. So for a sender, the strategy is a distribution that takes Cartesian product of the type and the messages to an interval of 0 and 1. It's a probability that says that given my own type, which I know, what signal should I send? right? Similarly, for the receiver who knows the messages and actions, given a message, what action he can take, there's a distribution on what message, what action he would take. Again, go back to Uber driver example. You know where you're going, you know what signal you should send, and then the driver knows whether to, on the signal he gets, which is fairly small amount of information, maybe your type, your reputation, your stars, whether you should accept the offer or not. Okay? So if these things are taken as they are, then there is a probability distribution, subjective probability distribution, that both parties can assume. Because based on the message I get, the action I take, I get utilities, I have some idea about what your type would be. So it's not that hard to see, but they will assume some kind of subjective probability. But the subjective probability may not be exactly the objective, the real probability. So the distribution of the passengers and the types may not match the subjective probability that you get. Right? Is this clear or no? So if you're an Uber driver and you get a call from Portland, you have some sort of subjective distribution whether the party would go to airport or go to Crater Lake or go to Seattle, but that may not be the objective probability distribution because not everybody is going to use the same receiver, same signaling to get where it is. But that would become the reality. Both sender and receiver will now operate under a reality that may or may not be the proper reality. Right? Is this clear or no? But because of sort of standard assumptions and the way it's structured, one can argue easily that there is a Nash equilibrium and they will reach an equilibrium. That means there will be a subjective probability distribution that both parties will agree to, even if it is not the objective probability distribution. And one can then define certain structure, certain desirable mapping between type and action for the sender and a desirable map between action and type for the receiver and some sort of rate distortion theory-based utility functions. So the idea is that the number of messages, I'm assuming here everything is discrete and finite. It can be generalized for compact sets, like intervals. So I want, if I'm a sender, I want to send as few messages as I want. The alphabet should be small, but the action that I get under the signal from the action that I wanted, the distortion function to be small. Right? So I want to send the least amount of signal to the Uber driver, but get the best Uber driver at the best place running at the best time. Right? Similarly, the receiver also has a utility function that says, I'll take the action based on the message that has small amount of rate, but also has least amount of distortion. Okay? Given all of these assumptions, you can show that there will be different kinds of subjective probability that will converge to in the Nash equilibrium that may or may not be same as the objective distribution. Okay. And the deception can then be defined as the Kullback-Leibler distance between the objective probability distribution and the subjective probability distribution that we are willing to agree to. Okay? So don't think that deception is a bad thing. As I said, one man's deception is another man's aspiration. So some of these deceptions may be necessary to get the liveness and liquidity in the system. Things will move unless you insist on truth and correctness and illiquidity and frozenness and no liveness. Right? So an interesting question comes up is how much deception is allowed and under what condition deception is allowed how much information should be asymmetrically preserved, how much information should be given, who I should encounter with. So all of these things lead to questions of trust. If you assume trust as correlation of encounter, then who should I encounter repeatedly with? Privacy should be related to asymmetry in information and information asymmetric advantages that I get. And secrets should be who I want to share with. So a lot of the things that we do in computer science could be framed in this structure. Right? It's not some subjective philosophical thing. It's a game, and the game we want to get to good Nash Equilibria, and in order to do that, what would be needed? It's possible that all parties that I interact with, I can interact with uniformly without any distinction. Then I trust everybody. It's possible that there is no information asymmetry, there is no secret, there is no privacy. So one can imagine systems over systems that we build, what they should be. And a lot of the institutions we built in the past were built to guarantee that we can play these games with good liquidity. So it's not asking that we want to build a completely deception-free, totally open, formally verifiable system. We are building a system where there will be certain things that will be unprovable. There will be certain things that we will not that will not know. There will be known unknowns, unknown unknowns, etc. But what we want are good Nash equilibria that keeps the system moving. Okay? How do we design those things? So one idea is to introduce various non-strategic agents, and I'll call them recommenders and verifiers. Recommenders help the sender to send new messages. So Netflix can say that you have watched a game of cards and you have watched this, you're Chinese, we recommend you watch Marco Polo. Right? There's no idea, there's no guarantee that I would actually like Marco Polo. Maybe my verifiers are other people who said, I watched Marco Polo, I hated it, and I see who he is. So systems like that are there, they are going to move. There is information asymmetry, privacy, etc., but statistically, there's information flow, either in over the mean field games or over time. And we can go into this in more details, and it has some similarity to the adaptive immune systems in metazoans, in jawed fish and jawless fish, and some act like B cells, some will act like T cells. If you know the biology, that's sort of the context. Yeah? So another way to think of recommenders and verifiers, recommenders are going to inject information into system in order to give it liveness or liquidity, and verifiers are the systems that will tell the receivers what action to take in order to be safe. Right? And you can see that in terms of the logic, they will counterbalance each other. But they are going to move your information across single receiver to multiple receivers and single senders to multiple senders. So one interesting concept is not honesty or transparency, but separability, right? So the idea is called separating equilibria. So if you, in the limit, if you could send infinitely many messages, then it would be transparent. But given the context that there are only finitely many information, it says basically each type T will send a different signal to get an action. Right? So separating equilibria are closest that will come to the truth. Right? So each type would induce different action under different messages. So ideally, if the message size, message cardinality is similar to the type cardinality, the best thing one can do is to reveal one's type. Right? But otherwise, the types will break into equivalence classes, and some equivalent classes will send same signal, act like as if they are same, but the effects would be more or less same. But they are not the only equilibria. There are other equilibria, which is one called pooling equilibria. That means no matter what message I get, I do the same action. Right? And then there is something else called babbling equilibria, where I do random action under random messages. So if you are used to watching ads on your computers or phone, if you're doing pooling equilibria, no matter what ad is, your ad blocker blocks it. You do the same thing. If you are babbling equilibria, when an ad comes, you do randomly buy or not buy it, ignore it. If you are separating equilibria, the advertiser actually shows you the ad that you need to see, and you do conversion the moment you see it. That would be the ideal world, right? Don't worry about the other things. There are other examples from biology that I didn't go into today. But there are two other issues that need to be dealt with. The Nash equilibria we get depend on the messages and the way the messages are assigned to tasks or signals or types, and that they are conventional. Right? So whether you drive on the left or right, either would result in a Nash equilibria, but the one we adopt is conventional. There's nothing special about it, right? And because I don't have to reveal all my type, I could be deceptive. I could choose a type to reveal that would get me the maximum utility. So main question is, how do we deal with these kinds of deceptions and conventions and build systems that are subjected to this? There are other ideas. Another idea is called costly signaling. So if you want to send me a message, it should cost you a lot to send me the message dishonestly. So if you are going to put my block in the blockchain, you need to solve a hard problem to show costly signaling. If you are a peacock, you want to mate with me, you need to do a very complicated dance and show your plumage, even if it does not give you any selection advantage, right? So costly signaling is one process, but the trouble with costly signaling is that often they become unbounded, right? Because there is competition, it could increase unboundedly so that all the Mongolians and Chinese are burning electricity to solve proof of work, and the transactions they're recording is not worth the energy they're consuming. And in that setting, the species or the technology will go extinct. Another idea is credible and uncredible threat. You catch somebody doing something incorrectly, dishonestly, and he pays a penalty. The credible threat is the one where the threat is actually executed. Non-credible threat is one where the threat is not actually executed, but the threat exists in a subgame perfect structures. Right? So examples is that you can lie to me, but there's somebody upstairs looking at you and will punish you on the resurrection day. Right? As long as you believe, that's a good way to get rid of deception. And the other thing that we are looking at is the structures with recommenders and verifiers. How am I doing with time?
15 minutes.
Okay, I'll go fast. So what's a great example of signaling game that we may face? One comes from Turing, and it's related to biomimicry, mimicry in general, but imitation game. And Turing very quickly realized that there's really no good definition of artificial intelligence given the undecidability and other things. The best one can define is to be able to imitate the structure of intelligence. Right? But that opens up the whole thing to signaling game. So you can think of Turing test in terms of an information-asymmetric signaling game. Some sender agents have the type oracles. They actually know the truth. They can tell you the truth. And such as, say, humans. And the other types are imitators. They are going to imitate an oracle. Okay? And that sets up the imitation game. And the sender sends certain signals, for example, conventional statements in English, to receivers who must act by responding to oracles but ignoring imitators. That's the Turing test. And you can imagine a reverse Turing test where receivers and senders exchange roles. Is this clear? And this would be the most interesting kind of cybersecurity that we will face in the near future because it's built on the concept of imitation game. Right? So here is the classical example of Turing's, from Turing's paper, except I changed the names. A is somebody who uses a universal quantifier. E is somebody who uses existential quantifier. So they're Abelard and Galois. And F is a test with Fulbert. I don't know. Do people know these stories? Okay, it's worth checking it out. It's interesting. It's not Alice and Bob stories anymore. So in a game theoretic setting, Abelard and Galois make much more interesting roles. So according to Turing, Abelard says, please write me a sonnet on the subject of the fourth breeze. He says, count me out on this one. I never could write poetry, etc., etc. And Fulbert has to figure out whether Abelard or Galois is a human or a bot. Right? So one Galois could be a human or a bot pretending to be a human, and is also going to make mistakes that humans make, etc. And actually, the example is to add two numbers. In fact, the sum is incorrect. And that was intentionally done by Galois to fool Abelard or Fulbert to think that it's a bot. Right? So given this, now imagine that not only do you have signaling game, but now you have a tool that will help you to fool anybody into thinking that you are of certain type. Right? What would be the cybersecurity issues? What would be the context in which some AI could be deployed or not? And we suggested a solution in terms of another game using recommenders and verifiers. And I'm not, oops, I went backward. Okay. Okay. So what we really, in order AI to succeed, what we'll really need is a pooling equilibrium. So no matter what the bot is saying, we will not be able to distinguish a human from a bot. But in another scheme, if you are willing to look at cybersecurity, you want separating equilibria. You want to be, no matter what happens, you should be able to tell a bot from a human. Okay. So what we would do is use something like recommenders and verifiers to recommend some other bots, some AI systems, and verifiers to be able to check whether they are bots or oracles. Okay. And there is an idea of how to create such a system that has components of Turing's imitation game, Minsky's society of mind, Spencer's signaling game, Turing learning, generative adversarial networks, approximate Bayesian network, Bayes, oracle Bayes, and empirical Bayes, and some idea of causality analysis. So it has to be more or less an interpretable AI, but also something that can be evaluated and ranked. So the future I'm imagining is one in which there are tons and tons of bots that are available almost freely, but what is not available and is costly is to be able to choose the right bot for the right task with a rank. So it's sort of like a page ranking algorithm for bots. Right? Which one is secure, which one is not. And that's actually a much more complicated problem than to build a bot that for all practical purposes, naively wins a Turing test. Is this clear or not? So, so there is a game in which you assign a ranking to each model for a particular data set, and the recommender proposes a bot, proposes a data set domain in which it will work, and proposes a rank. And the recommender can be deceptive or non-deceptive. I can propose the same bot over and over with higher and higher rank, or I can do whatever I want. You have no way of knowing whether the recommender is truthful or not. Okay? And there is a community of verifiers which will challenge the rank, and they will win or lose their stakes based on some empirical based test. And there's an underlying assumption that there is a perfect oracle that would have the best answer for the data sets, and the rank would be, the distance would be 0, and the rank would be the highest. Once you achieve that, there is no more need for more recommenders or verifiers. Okay? So under such assumptions, one can show there is a particular game in which you should be able to almost perfectly rank all the models as you get. I'm not going to go into this because it'll take some time. And there is component of costly signaling, pricing models, etc. And so it leads to blockchains. And there is a startup that I'm an advisor to and have equity positions that actually uses this to choose trading strategies for people. So basically, there are tons and tons of models to predict the price movements, and then there are recommenders and verifiers who choose models and choose the market, and they get ranked. So one day you should be able to go and say that I have this much money, I have this risk to return perspectives, give me the best model that would do this, and then it gives you sort of like a Google search engine that gives you 10 models ranked top to bottom, and you choose one and you play, and then you keep improving or losing the ranks. Yeah? Anyway, so it's called Prospero.ai. Prospero is a character in the Tempest, the main character. So I don't think I have much time, but these are things I talked about. There are examples of lots and lots of signaling games, intertwined signaling games over the internet. Google, Netflix, Bitcoins, all of these are examples of those games, ad games. And they are coupled with recommenders and verifiers that choose liveness and safety conditions in certain ways. And this is where the formal verification part comes in. So these are some of the examples of the games that we see in nature. Actually, the most interesting example would be the ad exchanges, which has a very complex infrastructures of recommenders and verifiers. There's ones like DMPs that do distributed management, data management plans that actually keep track of who you are using cookies and super cookies. And examples are companies like Taboola. There are attribution systems like DoubleClick that tells the advertiser whether the advertisement has right return of investment. Then there are advertisers, there's ad exchanges, there's attributions, a whole bunch of things that can be explained in the game theoretic setting that we described. So I'm not going to go into this. It also becomes more complex because some of these ads are state dependent. They do a funnel in which you have awareness and then interest, then conversion. So they actually push you through each stage. It's not a monolithic one ad for one setting. It actually is a temporal structure. So So I have written some patents, but not published. That depends on these ideas of cellularizing and this idea that I call cryptledgers. And that allows formal verification to be done automatically. So don't think of blockchain as a blockchain or duplicating blockchain as a main thing. Think of it as a system, data systems or model systems like crypto structures, and you need crypto structures that are bisimulation equivalent, right? And you have formal method algorithms to do this, model checking. So there is a sender. So the idea is that at some point you should be able to write down a sender-receiver signaling game, and there should be some system, probably from Galois, that can compile it into a business. And that creates the costly signaling, reputation system, pricing, all of this automatically. So designing a Uber would be automatic. Okay, so that should have description of a sender and a description of a receiver. The game will reach a Nash equilibrium that permits deception, but in this game it is tamed by checkers. The checkers will verify certain local properties, so certain propositional logic properties like identities and non-refutation. But there should be also some global properties that depend on time, either in a linear time logic or branching time logic, and that should be checked by a cryptledger. So there is combination of both cryptographic schemes and something that's more model. So each one will have asymmetric cryptography. There should be public verification key for the verifiers and also private signature key for the, sender and receivers both have verification keys and signature keys. And the keys are linked via computationally one-way functions. We prefer, I don't have time to go into why McAleese is better for these schemes than other public key crypto system. So it's the standard scheme. Sender sends a signal where he says the identity of the sender, identity of the receiver. So this can be verified. The message and a hash of the message and the time. And a timestamp. So all of these will go into a message being delivered to the receiver. Receiver with his verification key can check that the message came from the sender and is received by the receiver. The local properties are easy to check. The aim is consistent with T. There will be global properties that need to be checked over time. And they should satisfy certain modal properties. And R will then perform an action that's consistent with the message. And the S will get his utility, and R will get his utility. So to check the global, so checking local properties are easy because they are Boolean formulas. To check the global properties, we'll use the cryptledger. So these are partial order over time from different sender-receiver games. And they will be connected by this order. This will be continuously growing. There may be multiple copies of cryptledger, but they should be bisimulation equivalent.
Sorry, I forgot the definition of T. What's T?
Definition of T.
Records of T's and hash of T and M's.
T is little t, right?
Yeah.
Little t is a type. Type is just the personal.
Type of the, whether it's a deceptive or non-deceptive.
That's how game theoretic people used, but here we are using it as all private information, including whether you're deceptive or not, right? And these cryptledgers are maintained by miners, but the idea, the more interesting idea is that there is an intermediary who can, like, think of it as a exchange, person managing an exchange, that can combine all this information that are bisimulation equivalent to the crypt key structure the original cryptography structure, but can check whether certain properties are verified or not. Right? So it's distributed peer-to-peer system, but also gives the ability to create cellularize them through an intermediary, another agent, who should be a trusted agent. So it's not fully centralized, but it now allows you to verify the properties and perhaps do credible or non-credible thread or costly signaling. So that gets around the, we can discuss offline, but that gets around the problem of scaling and cost and all that, because everything is done in that. But the model checker is a bounded model checker, so it creates a Boolean circuit, and then it uses a Boolean zero knowledge snark to tell you whether your property is satisfied or not, but not reveal all the information of all the players in the exchange or the cell. So, and there are lots of examples. For example, almost all the things in finance can be done by cellularizing a bunch of people together. There are other games that I'm not going to go into, but with these structures, the interesting thing is that there are lots of things that can be created under these schemes and can be theoretically tested out. So these are some of the topics that I'm interested in, and use signaling games to discuss. There are lots of examples of signaling games in cancer, because cancer, especially if you believe cancer is a disease of the interaction of the immune systems and somatic verification systems like P53. Right? So a lot of these theories are applicable to that. Multicellularity and aging is another example. Immune system comes up in that context. On the internet, there are examples of cybersecurity, crypto coins, private data markets, something I call glass bead games. In economics, financial markets, exchanges, and dark pools. And in politics, governance is a great example. And historically goes back to Socratic examples of philosopher king. And so there's lots of examples of signaling games and building institutions on top of that. Anyway, I think I'm going to end here. It's a conventional end, but I think it's the beginning of lots of new ideas to come up. I don't know how well I was able to convey the ideas, but if there are questions, I'll happy to take it now or over email or whatever is good.
Anybody have any questions for Bud?
Yeah. Yeah?
Somebody have a question?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Question, I think you were presenting a way to analyze the various states and inputs of the system as a whole, and then determine whether or not there could be whether the system was going to orient towards I forgot the terminology, but a separate pooling or together pooling. Is that generally correct?
Well, so roughly what I'm saying is the signaling games are pervasive. Yeah. Information asymmetry, privacy are going to stay. And in these games, like any other game, there are equilibria, Nash equilibria. And the Nash equilibria, most of the Nash equilibria that can be reached quickly are pretty bad. Just as you'd say in the ads on the internet. They're either babbling equilibria or pooling equilibria. Either you get thrown random spam at you, or you have spam filter, you filter everything out. But what these games are supposed to do are something useful, some separating Nash equilibria. I mean, you wouldn't mind spams if they are addressed to your exact needs, even if it's coming from somebody you don't know.
I think you're saying those are objective. You can measure that specifically.
Right. So the main question is, how do I build systems that have such good separating equilibria? And in the general context, it may not be possible. Because any of these equilibria, once it's reached, it'll stay there because they're stable Nash equilibria. What are the mechanisms to incorporate so that I can get good separating Nash equilibria. Right? So one idea is to use costly signaling, make it costly. Another idea is to use credible, non-credible thread. Another idea, which is sort of in multi-party protocol, is to use equilibria from different interactions together so that that brings honesty into the system, right? Another idea is to find people whose utilities should be naturally aligned and pull them together so that they don't deceive each other. So how all these ideas, can they be grouped together so that if you tell me what signaling game you want to play, I should be able to build you the system. That's just roughly the gist of the things. But given that these are conventional and these are allow some amount of deception, it will never be perfect system, but there's a way to create a system that's good enough.
Okay.
Did I get it?
Yeah, you got it.
Okay.
And
And
get your message, your email, because I want to talk.
no, I mean, the other thing that I did not emphasize, because often I give this talk to biologists, is that at the core of it is going to be formal methods in cryptography and a combination of those. Because you need cryptography because there are private information. You don't, I'm not opting for a solution where there is one big monolithic organization that you can trust all your information with, and they will play the game for you. It doesn't work, right? On the other hand, I don't think it will work to be fully distributed and pay for honesty with huge amount of costly signaling. So the best idea is to create cells where you swim or drown together, and that forces your utilities to be aligned. And that also becomes a nature of credible threat, because if you don't do, right now, if you don't do certain things that are implied by your contract, there's nothing I can do to you. Nobody can do anything to you. But in the cells, I can throw you out. That's a fairly credible threat I can use.
But that depends on the game specifically.
That depends on the game. So there is no global distributed game in which I can achieve everything. Right. But again, as I have said to many people, I feel I'm at the beginning of something, not at the end. So there are lots of ideas here that needs to be worked out, proven, and analyzed, and implemented and tested. But the world is, to some degree, moving in this direction. Bitcoins, Ethereum, Libra, whatever. The interesting thing is that the community is now beginning to move towards verification, formal methods, rather than consensus or blockchains, which are just implementation-specific things, not the central goal. I think the central goal is that we will have to play signaling games. In signaling games, there will be information asymmetry. We can take advantage of information asymmetry through deception, but we need organizations and structures that get good Nash equilibria and keep it stable. Is this clear?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Any other question?
So I guess one thing I'd ask is, where have you seen more interest in? Trying to create Nash equilibrium, or actually trying to create intermediaries that are so biased and well-connected that they make one player come out on top every time? So in your experience with interactive industry, it's often not the case that you really want a Nash equilibrium. You actually want to win, right? You want to be,
Right.
Deception has a purpose in a lot of cases.
Right.
It usually has a very selfish purpose, but it's
Right.
a very lucrative purpose.
Right.
And so whether it's a government or a financial institution or something like this, it seems like understanding the game. can
Right.
be
Understand the
an
game
advantage
is
to say
right.
if-
Right. I did not address that issue, which is how do I design the game? Mechanism design
Yeah.
by itself is a specific thing. I'm not saying deception is good or bad. In fact, I'm saying all agents are rational. They know their utilities and they're optimizing their utilities. If they can optimize with deceptive way, then they are just being rational. I can't say they're good or bad, right? So it's not saying, but there are mechanisms that says that if you violate certain structures, certain invariants, you could get punished, or you can only send signals when you do certain things that are costly, right? In that case, can I reach utilities? Can I reach an equilibrium that's good for everybody, right? But traditionally, in a game theoretic way, there's nothing wrong about being rational or optimizing and being winner take all. If that's the case, then it's a bad game. Yeah.
Is there a result that you must have deception for the game in general to have optimal utility for all players?
The game has no. There are lots of games that have no deception. The utilities are aligned, or Shapley value is good. In that case, you don't need blockchain. You don't need formal verification because people are naturally oriented to do good things,
Oh, okay.
right?
Yeah. So okay. So I
So-
guess excluding that because like this scenario where every entity is trusted, like is not
Right,
really
because-
so we generally not.
Right, but if every agent is honest because that's part of the utility optimizing Nash equilibrium, you don't need blockchains, you don't need computation, you don't need anything, right? We need technologies when there are misalignment of utility. I mean, biology is full of examples like that because little variations gets you a different type, and different type gets eliminated by selection. So you have to, survival means mimicry and deception and all sorts of things. So there is a reason for signaling information asymmetric games to exist. And in fact, I think without that, there will be no symbiosis, right? Why would a sender do something with a receiver if they're already aligned, or a sender can do everything by himself, right? So these games are necessary to get more things than what you can get from individual agents. The question is, in the structure of game theory, it's very easy to get a bad Nash equilibrium, which is random or pooling. Right. So, did I answer your question? It's not that somebody.
It's really an answerable thing. I mean, you know, I guess the question is, are you really trying to prevent like corrupted, trading spaces in games like this, or so there's a question. One of my fields of interest has been, building good emergence, right? Building
Right.
an emergently good system, right? And in that case, if you have this ability to force structure into the interactions, and you have a trusted agent and all those kind of things that kind of guide it, yes, you can do certain things. Or if like you're building the emergent creation system, so a generator for all agents, for instance, that would give you the emergence you want. But generally, the problem is that you don't have that.
Right, you don't have that.
You don't have like a trusted intermediary. What you have is a social intermediary that comes out, which comes into things like creating bad influencers. Like intentionally creating an agent that, like let's say China might create a clearinghouse for financial transactions that's faster than anything else in the world because they want everyone to start trusting that, right?
Right.
But after 2 or 3 years, they might change it into something that benefits them significantly because everyone trusts them to this kind of thing. Even though at this point it should become obvious if you're observing it for long enough that it's doing something nefarious. And so our social systems generally are built around this kind of, I like this right now, I like this right now, I like this right now. And part of the idea of an adversary is essentially to play into your weaknesses of trust.
Right, but that's not, well, your example is not really a difficulty with game theory, it's a problem with repeated games. In the repeated games, I can always play the game over and over and play only the parts that will not necessarily help me, but gives the impression that you should trust me and you should eliminate other agencies. So for example, if I'm Amazon, I could lower the price of books to $9.99 until Barnes & Noble goes away, and et cetera, and then when everybody's gone, I can raise the price. So like being a loss leader. And that is selected away through information distribution through recommenders and verifiers. So for example, a recommender could recommend that you should, every 10th book you buy should be bought from Barnes and Nobles. If Barnes and Noble goes away, Amazon will raise your price. There's similarly, I think in the Village, there's a card that you carry, and if you buy 10 different coffees from 10 different shops, the 11th shop gives you a free coffee. Right? So the idea is to get around Starbucks and others creating loyalty schemes where you would do exactly what you described. But so it's part due to the repeated games. There's a part, and another solution is to call trembling hand. No matter what game you're playing, your hand should often tremble, and you should choose a strategy that's not necessarily myopically optimal. Right? So all those things from game theory would be available. But on top of that, there is a system of recommenders and verifiers who would allocate these informations and these strategies and choose you to do certain things so that affects your long-term optimality. Right? One reason for having asymmetry or privacy is to avoid differential pricing by doing exactly what you described. Somebody gives me things, collects information, and then the moment he knows that I can actually pay a higher price, he raises the price. That's why I need privacy. So one way I can do that is by having multiple identities and buy things under different identities. So those are orthogonal to what I'm describing. Those are techniques from game theory. Or the game that you want to play, they may not have good mechanisms. But if they do, if the game is right, then I want to give a system that can implement it with the machinery that I just described. I don't know if I answered your question or not, but this is a long discussion.
My question's not really meant to be answered so much as I think
But
one way I look at these kind of systems is thinking how to break it and how to.
Right.
If I understand, especially when anyone tells me something's optimal, I'm just like, oh, this is going to be fun. So like, taking into account an adversary whose entire goal is to make a short-term profit, not a long.
Right.
They don't want to be a part of the system forever. All they want to do is make $100 million.
Right.
I don't know if you can make one that really stops them from doing that. If your goal is to make a perfect system where Nash equilibriums are such that everyone who deserves to have, like you think about it in a biological way, like natural selection, everything should have given us all what you need. But if someone were to come in and do a Ponzi scheme or other kinds of things and potentially bankrupt the system completely,
Right.
and cause it to not be an indefinite game, like even though it was built to be one, it might actually bankrupt the system by doing something that you weren't expecting. And ultimately, there have been several cryptocurrencies that have failed this way by, for instance, pillaging the exchanges. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, it's something you weren't expecting. It wasn't part of your signaling game that you really had, and it was an asymmetric attack.
Right. So here, your recommenders and verifiers. So the idea would be to build a cell of certain people who have certain reputations and combine them to a cell. So now it begins to sound like more traditional structure that has that properties. And you have verification systems and zero-knowledge proofs to check that you are actually following the thing. That may get you much better assurance that somebody is not playing a Ponzi scheme, right? Because there may not be a rational explanation why somebody is continuously losing and not doing anything. Right? So that property may be encoded, and formal verification will check that that's not what he is doing. But those are sort of orthogonal to my talk because I'm assuming they will come from game theory.
Yeah.
And if it's a good game, it can be implemented properly. But I think the key role will be recommenders and verifiers and zero-knowledge proofs.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
I would assume there's no one still
Any
at
question?
the library with it late. Is there any other questions? Well, thank you for coming, bud.
Thank you. There are lots of good examples in biology.